So this is actually a treat because it's like having the test in front of you and being able to ask the questions, and the panelists don't know the questions. But I'm not here to trick you. So I thought maybe we'd just start. You've shared a lot of research and many concepts and ideas that perhaps communities can put forth. I'm just curious, from your perspective, with all the research and all the great ideas that are out there, why haven't we been successful as a society or as a nation in addressing the literacy, making sure that all students are literate across the nation?
I'll start.
Oh, wait, you have to use the mic. There we go.
I think one of the reasons is we cannot do it alone. Ralph said that very poignantly today, but one of the things that we recognize is that children, especially in poverty, need a 360 surround. They need something that starts at birth, that continues with them. Too many of our interventions are short-term magic bullets. We have an example of that here in the city, where all of a sudden pre-K is the answer, and we don't think about the sustainable kinds of supports that these students are going to need to have. So when we think about that, we have to begin to collaborate more thoroughly than we ever have before. We're involved in an interesting experiment here in the Bronx, and we're focusing on how can we bring every single outside intervention, whether it's after school, teacher training, parent involvement, library support, how can we put it all together? And how can we begin to criticize ourselves and ask, are we moving the needle? Are we changing the odds for these children? And if we're not, how can we redesign the system so that we're not stepping over each other, but we're actually creating a sustained and collaborative approach to children's achievement?
So there's a great quote, and I have to confess, I'm not going to come up with the person who actually said it. But picking up on Susan's point, systems are perfectly designed to achieve the outcomes they achieve, right? So the idea is, right now we have a society that is willing to forget about the lowest, most vulnerable children. And not one of us in this room is willing to do that. But one of the things, and I think Ralph said this eloquently, is we need to think about our system, right? We've got summer, and we know, especially for the children living in poverty, summers are not good news, right? They're not going off to summer camp or learning to play the viola. They're probably in a sweltering city, and if they're lucky, they're sitting in front of a TV set. And it's probably on soap operas, not Sesame Street, right? We know that after school is a time that we could do more. And of course, parents, and I'm so glad that they're part of this conversation. But I also have to feel hopeful, because we have people like Ray and the teachers and principals and superintendent I met with yesterday from Yonkers, who really care about this, who are skeptical, who said, so really, how is this going to work? How is this going to operate in our system? And that's what's going to get us through, because I think we've become aware and we care, and we finally have research helping us out instead of going off on a tangent on things we actually don't care that much about. And so I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that this system is going to shift, that we're going to move all the pieces of it that need to move, and that 10 years from now, we're going to look back and go, we figured out most of it. We still have a ways to go, but we figured out most of it.
Thank you. You heard me describe the campaign as the response to a call to action about disrupting intergenerational poverty. Quite frankly, that was not what we said publicly in 2010, because in 2010 you couldn't talk about poverty without seeming to be totally unrealistic, out of touch with reality, or it was a kind of a ideological position that was being adopted for some reason. Really, talking about poverty has come back into fashion because there are people like Paul Ryan and others who are now willing to talk about poverty. And the answer to your question, Ray, is that the reading gap, the achievement gap, the over-incarceration of young people of color, the discipline disparities, these are all essentially symptoms of the same thing, and that is our willingness to tolerate in this society, in the richest country in the history of the world, a level of poverty that would be unacceptable in almost any other industrialized country. And we do it in part because poverty has been racialized. And most of us have been silent, so we work around the edges. And I think what I'm most hopeful about is that you're now having a bipartisan conversation about poverty, a bipartisan conversation that is totally ignored by the media. Totally ignored by the media, because most of us seem perfectly willing and perfectly comfortable to coexist with a high level of poverty. And this notion, and Susan, you said it, that I just flinched for a moment. The fact of the matter is, we cannot educate and succeed with kids who are in poverty and make them look like middle-class kids and rich kids who are not. And there's amazing work being done that shows it's possible, but what we know is it's not likely. And Paul Revels, the former commissioner of Massachusetts, says when you look at Massachusetts, you can see what we've done to create excellence, and Massachusetts can compete with any country in the world if you look at the top half of their students. But Massachusetts also has the biggest equity gap. And he says, we're not going to be able to get where we need to go if we continue doing what we know can get us excellence without being forthright and doing what we know will get us equity. And what will get us equity is committed to end poverty.
Great, thank you. It's worthy of a round of applause, too. I can hear someone there. So we've learned a lot, and I think one of the things that we all are seeking to do is take some action. And I guess from your perspective, what would be one important step that we, serving different communities, can do to coalesce? And at the same time, what's the one thing that you think we should be focusing on as we proceed?
You want to go first again?
You go first.
Okay, I'll go first. So my work has focused primarily on schools, although schools are part of a larger system. But so I'm going to speak to schools because in our society, the way it's currently organized, schools are the one place that we can actually go in and make a difference and not step on toes. Hopefully parents are going to change. I'm hoping, because I agree with Ralph in that regard. Preschool is a way to essentially reach out to those kids if you're not willing to, or as, you know, and maybe it's the way to get parents. But I'm going to focus on schools for a second. Schools are at a crossroads. Since 2002, we've had something called the Institute of Education Sciences at the Department of Ed. And how many of you have ever heard of Ies, or the Institute of Education Sciences? Which is really too bad. The IES is the NIH of education. And what NIH did for healthcare, finding cures for cancer, helping us understand autism, is what IES is trying to do for education. And your research was probably funded by IES, right?
Right.
Right? And so I think that one of the things we can do as educators is to really look at what the research is that's coming out of IES. Now they have a terrible website called the What Works Clearinghouse, which is really hard to use. They're working on it. They've taken feedback. On the other hand, you can talk to Susan, you can talk to me, you can talk to other researchers, and they can help you find what actually works. And I would encourage every school person who's in a position of authority to look up IES on the web. It's ies.ed.gov, and see what they have to offer. Probably the most useful resource right now are their practice guides. And essentially what they do is they pull experts together, including teachers, principals, and researchers. And they go, okay, based on what we know right now, what should schools be doing about building foundational skills, reading comprehension, response to intervention, children with special needs, assessment. These practice guides are wonderful, and yet not anybody in this room knew about IES. How many know about the IES practice guides? Okay, look them up. They're fabulous. They're written in easy to understand language, and they talk about levels of evidence. And especially as the responsibility for using evidence-based practices is coming back to the states because of ESSA, which is great, states have really got to start thinking about this. And so I think leaving the system aside, because I do believe we have to fix the system and we have to fix poverty, schools can take a tremendous step forward by really thinking about whether or not what they're using has evidence that's going to work.
Let me just add something very narrow, but it's got big implications, and that's attendance. That's attendance. A community that really takes every student in school every day seriously, and says we will eliminate chronic absence, or we will reduce it by 50% over this period of time. Attendance has a high leverage. It's a high leverage strategy, because you're not going to dramatically reduce attendance unless you get involved with families. You're not going to reduce attendance unless you deal with family and student mobility. You're not going to reduce chronic absence unless you deal with health, and unless you deal with the kids who get sick at home because of the asthma and that triggers in their homes, such as mold. You're not going to reduce attendance unless you deal with making sure kids have good oral health care with nutrition. So attendance is one of those things you can get your arms around. You can measure increments of change month over month, sometimes week over week, which means that people can see small successes and continue to push forward. But it also has high leverage, that it's a kind of a portal to dealing with a whole series of other issues and problems. So when I look at the communities that have done attendance, they're really well on their way to some big things.
So I have a little bit of a different word, and that is context. You know, I was with the federal government, and I was a federal officer in charge of No Child Left Behind, which attempted to federalize or create a common set of strategies and accountability and standards across the country. And I came away from that experience saying, this doesn't work. That what we have to be responsible for, your community is different than the community in which I live. Your community is special. And what we find very often with our students who are coming from NYU, who are wonderful, is they don't understand the context in which they're working when they go to the school. So we can take a very good intervention. Let's take something that has been researched a lot, like Success for All, or maybe it's just a good example. And let's plop it in Yonkers. And that's what often happens. Someone plops an intervention in a context. And even though it has very, very sound research somewhere else, somehow it doesn't work here. And what I believe very strongly is that we have not been sensitive to the context in which our students and our teachers and our parents work and live. and that we must be much more sensitive to the local community, what the local parents feel is important, what the local people understand as really interventions that work for them. So again, what I suggest is read the research, yes, but always be sensitive to the adaptations that need to occur to make it work for your community, knowing that education is a local issue.
Okay, thank you. I just want to piggyback on what Ralph said. When we talk about attendance, and just to put things in perspective, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but chronic absences is basically missing 10% of your entire school year. So if you put that in perspective, that's 18 days. Doesn't seem like a lot over time because that actually is a little less than 2 days a month. But the message to parents and to everyone else is that we need our students in our schools every day, every minute. So when we consider extending the vacations, just that extra day, that impacts children. When we just pull them out a little bit early because I have to get somewhere, it impacts students. So I think your message is a very important one, and actually tied to that is the research that students don't achieve at the levels that they can achieve if they miss that 10% of instruction. I want to thank you all for your comments. I'll just pause for a moment, see if there's any questions from this brilliant audience that I'm staring at.
Well, what do you do if in the middle of the day a parent shows up and says, I'm taking the kid out? You stop them.
Oh, this is a question directed at me.
Yeah, good.
This is a superintendent.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's yours.
What did you call me, a Marine?
Yeah.
I mean, I think number one, there's always going to be, there are the times where you have a reason to pull the child. I'm not ignorant to the fact that, sometimes there are those set appointments. But I think my role and the role of the faculty and the entire building is to make sure that parents are aware of the impact it can have on their child. So in other words, let's not make it a habit as we proceed and go forward. If it continues, we do have those independent one-on-one conversations with individual parents saying that this is going to have an impact on your child, and it could have an adverse impact on your child, not the positive impact that we want to see. So there's kind of twofold.
I'd just like to add one more thing, Ray. We did a study and we found that that children were absent a great deal in Head Start. And so to add to your point, it's a pattern that gets started very, very early. If you don't correct it in the very, very beginning, it will only get worse.
So I'll just add, because this is more so from an auditing perspective, one of the reasons actually that we've started implementing and structuring school-based health centers, because it's an opportunity for children, if sick, they can actually go directly to a doctor within the school setting. And oftentimes when parents have to pull their child, we've all been to the doctor. We know that it's not a half-hour appointment. And it could be something that, in essence, warranted having the child pulled, or it could be something that the child, a situation where the child could have returned back to class. So when we look at community schools, which was referenced, and also this opportunity to bring services into the schools, it could have a real impact to make sure that we maintain that instructional time that we want, and is extremely valuable to our teachers and to the students. Other questions? Yes.
For Susan, sort of on the heels of your feelings that the child left behind was not a success, that being the group child with core standards, that thinking, what's your feelings about the current standards, especially the engagement or curriculum that many districts have adopted in regards to developmental appropriateness, especially for the little ones?
Oh, that's a toughie. Again, I'm a fan of Common Core standards because the Common Core standards are closer to any model of reading that I know. In other words, they focus on the importance of knowledge through text. They do not provide a very helpful learning progression, especially for those of us who work with very young children. So they immediately expect children to do things like intertextuality before they even learn about the sounds of our language. And so I think that what happened with the Common Core is they back mapped and they said, oh yeah, the early years. You know, I mean, almost as if it were an afterthought. So it's very thoughtlessly characterized for those of us who work in the early years, where oral language development is so critically important, the foundation of what we know about literacy. So in many ways, I think the implementation, especially in New York, was just horrendous. I think that some of the curriculum recommendations have not been wise and thoughtful. I think, of course, evaluating teachers on something they never taught was really unique to New York, et cetera.
Any other questions from the audience?
Is there
Alana?
anything that you have found across the country in your work that has been really promising in terms of something a community has done together to get the kids on grade level reading?
So I think, so I've been everywhere. Partly my husband's fault, but it's been my fault too. And I've been involved with schools throughout my career. And so I was actually fortunate. I was in Florida when Florida went from one of the very worst states with regard to education to one of the top 10, right? And I watched how they did it. And I think that's the single best example of how community and policy and universities and schools and nonprofits work together to really turn around a broken system. And if you think about Florida, it makes sense they wouldn't be great at education because a lot of people go down to retire, there's no income tax, cheap to live. But they did a couple of things. They did a combination of passing fairly enlightened laws like class size limits, right? So one of the comments when I was showing a videotape yesterday is, well, there were only 20 kids in that classroom. Well, guess what? In Florida, that's what they do because it's in the Constitution. They've passed laws that children who aren't reading proficiently in 3rd grade don't necessarily get retained, but they have to go to summer school. And those funds have to be made available. They have voluntary pre-K and they have parenting programs. And so they didn't just pick one thing. Like I was in Arizona and they passed kid has to be retained if they're not reading well in 3rd grade. It's like, okay. So, but what about all that other stuff that Florida did? And I think Florida proves you can do it, right? But they didn't do one thing. They didn't focus on one thing. It was passing smart laws. It was investing in our most vulnerable children and making sure that the schools used evidence-based practices. I mean, they legislated which curriculum the districts could buy. Now, I can't see that happening here in New York. No. Certainly not in Arizona, that was not gonna happen. Not sure, I think California does do that, right? So it depends, right? How committed is the state, is the community? Are you willing to do the tough work of making sure every kid succeeds? And so that's my one example, Florida.
I'm going to let Ralph have the last word because he's so wonderfully articulate. But I'm part of an initiative called the Broader Boulder Initiative. And basically what it argues is it's a little bit like Harlem's Children's Zone. And it argues that we need to bring together more of our services in a collaborative way, that where these services work together. I can tell you when I go into the schools, people are tripping over one another. They are. There's so many interventions, you can't keep your head straight. And it's horrible on the teachers. It's really difficult. So I would say a community-based effort is the way to go. I'll turn it over to you.
And I would agree with that.
Oh, good.
We have 94 communities that have made progress on either readiness attendance or summer learning. On one of them, we've got 47 that's made progress on 2. We've got about a dozen that's made progress on all 3. And almost every community that's made progress in all three, we've seen progress on grade level reading. And notice I'm saying progress. But what we're finding is, this is your point, context matters. And it's not that the readiness, attendance, summer learning trilogy is driving directly that progress in reading. It is that the people who have come together to do those things are also doing other things. They're paying more attention to what's going on in the classroom. They've done a better job of organizing volunteers. They have experience core, there's no one thing, the Minnesota Reading Corps. There are a lot of things that are now happening in and with schools, but once a community comes together and begins to put the pieces, you're finding that there's a kind of a stone soup strategy approach. The Boys and Girls Clubs, the Ys, folks are all now putting it together. And in those communities where we're seeing progress on all three, plus grade level reading, we can't take credit that the trilogy was driving the result, that what the trilogy, the triad managed to do was pull a lot of people into the game, and those folks, it's created a dynamic where those folks are now contributing what they can in a more organized, less chaotic way. And I think it's the more organized, less chaotic approach with all the various pieces that's really producing the result. Right. And it's good to see. Yeah. So we're being very careful not to go out there claiming, well, this proves the logic model works, because I do not think that I want to be clear, I do not think that if you just get kids ready, if you just get them to show up, and if you take care of them during the summer, that you're going to see increases in reading, unless you do the things that you're both talking about. I don't think you're going to see it, but you're more likely to see it if you've got everybody focused on it.
Right. So you've each shared so much with us in terms of the research and, again, practical ideas. I'm just wondering, before we conclude, if there's one thing that you have in your mind that you want to make sure you share with us that maybe we haven't asked in the form of a question, or maybe wasn't on your slides, that you think is really important for us as we take steps to support our children.
All right, well,
Every student present. Who's here represented? Every student. Every student present. That's my one thing. Go for it.
I would have to say everybody sitting in this room should give themselves a round of applause, because you're here today, you care, you're going to make a difference, and it's the sustained effort, it's the persistence, and the not giving up, and not being afraid to make mistakes, right? It's never going to be one thing, and but I just want to give all of you a round of applause, because you're fantastic, and this is what's going to make a difference for Yonkers and this greater New York area. So good for you.
So if I can ask our audience to please give our panelists a round of applause.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you for the opportunity. I'm just going to leave you with a quote from George Lucas, where he says, "Always remember your focus, because it determines your reality." So I encourage you each to focus on helping our students. And our reality should be that all children are reading at grade level, third grade reading level by the end of third grade. Thank you.
So, how many people have ever edited anything? And how many people have had multiple people looking at things for mistakes and something slipped by? Well, we made a whopper.
What?
Because we just had Ray Sanchez up here speaking with Raymond Garcia's name up here.
Oh, no.
It is spelled correctly. It's extremely embarrassing, and I'm very sorry. It went through about 6 sets of eyes, and nobody caught it. All right, there you go. I also would like to thank all of you for being here. For those who have not signed up for this afternoon at 1:30, you can still come. And we will be meeting upstairs in the room that used to be in the gallery, one floor up. And we will be talking about summer learning loss and setting up libraries in a way that will be most effective to combat summer learning loss, and a few other tidbits along with it. I'd like to thank all of you. We will have, we've taped this entire session because we want it to be able to be broadly used, and that will be available to you. Shannon, is it through our website? Okay. Shannon will send out an e-newsletter, and it will be made available to you. We'll also have the links to Ralph's tape, and to we will also have the PowerPoints for both Susan and for Carol available. So you can share it with all of your friends who could not be here. I thank you all for the hard work that you do every day, and your commitment to the children of Westchester and Putnam, and to making them successful in their path through life. To our presenters, wow, you were absolutely amazing. We've learned about research, we've learned effective practices, and we've learned what's happening and where we need to go further if we want to be able to help every one of our children to be successful. So thank you to all of you, and we'll see some of you later.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
How are you getting back to the city?
How do I?